Welcome back to the Cyber Executive, the podcast where we mix technology, risk, and leadership like a cocktail you didn't know you even needed, but now you can't live without. I'm your host, Marc Ashworth, and today I'm excited about our guest. She is the Director of Global Cybersecurity at Peabody Energy and a close friend of mine, Kristi Cook. Kristi, thank you for jumping on the mic with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get rolling, do me a quick favor, tap that follow button on your favorite podcasting app and share the Cyber Executive with your friends, coworkers, and that one person in IT who sighs loudly every time someone clicks on a suspicious leak. Let's spread the cyber love. Kristi, I'm excited here. We've done a lot of public discussions in the past and everything, so I'm so excited to have you here on the podcast and to talk about data and AI and security and anything else wherever we go with it today. So it should be a lot of fun. So so when people hear AI security, they often think about models and prompts, but you said data protection is the real foundation of this. So why does everything start there with data?
You know, One thing I've noticed, every organization is trying to do something different with AI. And that's kind of the beauty of it. There's endless opportunities of development and progress that we can make with it. With that, I think it's kind of the opportunity where a lot of us need to take a step back throughout organizations and go back to the foundations of cybersecurity. AI is moving technology much faster at a much rapid pace than any of us ever realized. So it's really time for us to go back and say, what are we feeding into it and where does that come from? What's the quality of that data that's being fed into it? And how are we confident that what's going into our models is what we actually want to go in there to begin with?
Yeah, and I think it's important too. It all starts with the data in the first place. So to be able to protect that data and have that security around there, whether it's DLP or whatever it might be, I think is crucial because if you're protecting the data, then how it's
hmm
being used becomes less of an issue of how it's being ingested then at that point, right?
Correct. Yeah. And it's interesting. I've really gotten out of the habit of using the term DLP intentionally. I don't know if you've gone through this in the past, but it seems like DLP is turned into kind of a dirty word in a while, just because I think collectively we have realized how difficult it can actually be to properly secure data in our organizations. And I think that's what AI is really forcing us down to, is to reevaluate how we're protecting data, what we're using to do that, and what our processes even look like around that.
Yeah, I agree. It's always been a challenge, and the products that's out there does a mediocre job at best. And you would think after all these years, with all the data that's been out, and with all the government stuff, that we would have a good data protection solution,
hmm
out there. And it's just so many false positives. It's so clunky to work with. It is very challenging, that's for sure.
It is. And they also tend to be so expensive too. I
Hmm.
can't tell you how many different tools over the years I have quoted out, I have piloted and experimented with bits and pieces of different tools. And it just, a lot of times, just not feasible. Even money aside, a lot of the tools that we've dealt with in the past, the administration, just to keep them functioning, they've been convoluted and overcomplicated. And I think that's really where we're at a crossroads right now, is how do we readdress and find new ways to see what data we have and how do we protect that?
Yeah, and the industry's really moved to a server centric and not the endpoint. Well,
Mhm.
it's the endpoint where the exfiltration is going to take place. So why are you moving the DLP or whatever you want, data protection at the server level whenever it's the end user that is causing? I don't get that trend. I don't understand that why they're doing that. So it's just yeah, it's kind of a messed up industry right now on that component, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. And that's one of those, I guess that's one of the aspects that have kind of brought me around to how can we take a step back from this and see what we already have. I think in a way that we overcomplicate our data protection as an industry, right? To some extent, we say, let's throw tools at it, let's throw products at it. It'll take care of itself and go do its own thing. But that's not, I think, realistic in a lot of ways. Um, so it's kind of that opportunity to step back and say, what do I already have that might be able to solve some of these problems on a smaller scale, that I might be able to manage because I'm already managing it?
Yeah, and the whole AI risk is really overwhelming in general for leaders. And so, how do you think, or how can you explain the idea of taking small, manageable steps that create meaningful security wins when it comes to AI risk?
You know, one of the things is going back to, I hate circling back around to data, but first asking, what data do you even have, right? The data for your company that you find important is going to be much different than the data we find important from, the company I work for. And so I think it's really important for organizations to go back and say, let's have a proper data governance overview, right? We don't have to get complicated, but let's identify who is it in our organization that's a stakeholder in understanding what data is important to us. Find out what data we actually care about. And then we can say who's responsible for that data, who owns that data, who modifies, manipulates that data. And how can we get them involved? And how can we get those stakeholders actually care what's happening to their data going forward?
Yeah, and so with the company beginning to use AI internally, where do you think the very first data protection move a company should make, or what do you
Mhm.
recommend that they should make there for that?
First, I think it's, identifying the data. And a lot of this, I think, again, is sitting down to those stakeholders. Helping them understand risk. So identify data, helping the stakeholders understand risk. So in my former military days, we'd have this most likely course of action and most dangerous course of action. And so I like to go through these exercises with stakeholders and I say, so this is the data you work with. What do you think is going to happen with this data? What is it from day to day? What's normally that takes place with it? Okay, so now in your imagination, in your broad imagination, what is the absolute worst case that could happen? What happens if this does go public without you meaning to? What happens if this gets released to a larger audience within the company without you meaning to? And so we kind of have this conversation. And a lot of times, while it seems a lot of fun, it also has a lot of light bulbs. And I think it helps have that conversation of risk and they start to understand it a lot more. So we understand risk. And then the third step, I really like to go to is how do we actually start labeling our risky data? And what a lot of organizations don't realize is we actually have a lot of built-in tools already at our hands to help us with data discovery, data classification, and data labeling. That makes it really easy. So once we start getting these three steps in place, those are some of the most foundational pieces that plenty of organizations of all sizes are missing out on that they need to get ahead of and get their hands on prior to opening AI at large scale.
Yeah, so can you share an example where a relatively small data control, like classification or access restriction, can end up dramatically reducing AI risk?
Sure. Let's take Microsoft Office 365, for example. I think a lot of us will agree that while there's a lot of great capabilities in the 365 tenants, it can be really hard to manage. Data protection, if you are very selective on how you're using it, it doesn't have to be very difficult. So you can start identifying your data and having users, let's say from this point forward, when you create data, you are now forced to tag a label associated to it for that classification. So rather than approaching this from we have to get everything classified, everything tagged right here and there, let's take small steps, small wins. So anything new from this point forward, we're going to start tagging and labeling. And then we can have our separate project that says, let's go back and get all of our historic data properly categorized, classified, and labeled. But just making those moves so that we are moving forward, I think is where we need to understand our big wins are going to be. Because once you have that tagged and labeled, you can start making much stricter rules on this cannot be used in LLM models, or this can only be used in certain models that are internal, or only go to these tenants. And it becomes much simpler to control your data once you have those proper tags in place.
Yeah, understanding your data, what data should be allowed into AI versus experimentation with data is important. So is there a common concern around security, or I guess a common concern around security is that security will slow AI adoption. So how do you design a data protection control that will enable AI and enable the business to be successful rather than block it?
I think that's one that maybe all of us are struggling with a little bit. I'd say I think we've done a great job, in my organization, just saying let's make security part of our projects up front, and it's no different when it comes to AI. So we get these new programs or platforms in place, and they're explaining, what it's going to do for us. I'm helping have those conversations to enable those projects to be successful by saying, do you know what the data is that they're pulling from? Do you know who the owners are of those data, that data, and where do you even get that data from? What are they going to do with it? Then we also kind of help enable earlier on, what are the controls in place that we're going to have to help you through? And so they're not going to have to go back to us later on. We're working alongside them from the very first step of exploring options.
Yeah, and I think the vendors themselves are making it very challenging for security and IT teams to roll out AI and to protect
Mhm.
it because, I mean, Microsoft, every time you turn around, Copilot is now enabled in a different product. And so to better align your security controls to where you're not overlooking and repurposing things. So how do you design that control so that way you're protecting the AI data? When all these vendors are coming at you in different ways.
You know, one of the big questions is, what are we going to allow with AI? And I don't think that's a stagnant conversation. I think organizations are going to ask themselves that constantly. What types of AI are we going to allow within our organization? How are we going to use it? How are we going to evaluate the data that is used in it? And if any organization says, this is our policy and we're steadfast on it, I don't think they're being realistic because of how quickly that technology is changing. So the sooner that we can encourage our organizations to bring us into the conversations upfront, before those selections are made within AI, whenever they're talking about the policies on how we're going to, use AI within in the organization, the more we can enable those products to be placed within our organizations at a much faster pace, which is honestly what's going to happen. I think the vendors are enabling a massive growth of shadow IT, not intentionally, but now that a lot of this is so easily accessible, I think it's growing at a very fast pace that's getting very difficult to manage. So we just have to work alongside the business from the very first step as best we can.
Yeah, and training obviously is a key component of that to train the users to make sure that they know what's good, what's bad, what to
Mhm.
put in, and everything. So, we mentioned about the integrations happening so much, but how do you prevent sensitive data from leaking into the public or third-party AI models without banning them whenever it's getting harder and harder to tell that this is a safe way or a containerized way of using AI versus the public model?
Well, I think that's where we go back to saying, hey, do we have our foundational controls in place? Do How do we feel about our identity and access management? Have we identified what our identities and our agents are? How are we treating our identities and what they have access to? How are we controlling that? Are we confident in our role-based access controls? And on the same time, it's going back to, are we confident in that classification and that labeling and what our identities have access to within our data sources? We really just need to go back and make sure, because if you have properly labeled data, in each of your data stores, it's going to make it much easier to put rules in place to say, hey, anything that is confidential, anything that's high risk, anything that's whatever your, naming scheme is going to be for your classification, say you go ahead and block that from, external platforms. That's definitely easier up front. And so you might not be controlling all of your data, but at least those that you have identified as high risk, you're going to have a little bit more control, regardless of that shadow IT and AI coming at you left and right.
Yeah, and in doing this strategy around this, one of the things that's hard for the security teams to not be is that department of no. And but we have to make sure we're enabling the business, but we have to let them do that safely. So how do we be the security teams? How do you help your security team become a more trusted advisor to AI adoption versus that department of no?
I'll be honest, one of the things I have really pushed my team to do is to get out and involved in the business. And what I mean by that is, I work for a mining company. We physically go out to the mines. We get to know the people that we are working with and the people that we're working for. And I don't just mean the product. Of course, we need to know our products, but shake hands with the people out there and not just leadership. Yes, it's great to know your board and your executive leadership team, but the ones that are actually have the boots on the ground that are saying, this is the problem I have today, and I'm going to have problems tomorrow. I need to have a face to a name of who I can go to So they're the ones that are getting these vendors going to them and saying, we can solve all your data analysis problems with this shiny new tool. And they can be like, you know what? I just talked to John last week. He was out here. Let me see what he has to think of this, because that sounds really cool, but I feel like there's probably a lot involved in that. So whenever our business has a name and a face to go to ask questions easier, um, it's going to be a much easier conversation and happen much faster rather than waiting for the formal governance processes when they can shoot a Teams message and say, I had a vendor asking about this. What do you think? And so I'm really trying to enable my team to have those comfortable conversations, much easier just by knowing the business and the people here.
One of the things with that is, around AI and data is that it's a fundamental shift on how we have to protect that, as well as uh, how the business is using that. And so it's a different mind shift. So how do you encourage your teams to change that mind shift for AI usage and adoption?
You know, the shift in my mind is how quickly technology is changing. And I think that's really a struggle. The shift for me is saying, can we keep up with the change in technology while also going back and doing these foundations, that I keep talking about? So I'm telling my team, meet people, get to know the business, but let's take our steps back also, and let's make sure we're evaluating constantly what we already have in place rather than overcomplicating and just throwing extra layers of controls on top of each other.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier around, DOP or data protection, however,
Mhm.
we want to call it and stuff. But with AI and just in general, how do you keep that from becoming such a manual process or a policy heavy exercise that
Mhm.
really no one's going to follow because it's too complicated?
I hate to say this, but where you're able to, putting the automated rules in place and alerting does help with that. Again, you know, we go back to once you classify and start tagging your data, you can set up that alerting, simplify a lot of that process. Again, I've really taken the step of what do I already have in my environment? So I'm not adding extra agents. I'm not adding extra layer of security. I'm not adding these extra controls in place that are, more expensive and more people have to manage. What have I already got that I can integrate rules using those data tagging classification? And so then I've set up, when we first started, it was what high level rules do I have, right? What are the big issues? Our most sensitive data that I definitely need to make sure is not going anywhere. And then as we kind of narrow it down, as we go down the path, it's saying, okay, now we need data that's a little less risky, but still has some risk to it in certain scenarios and situations. So once we kind of get those big wins, we can start focusing on narrowing down what those alerts look like. And then with that, it goes back to having those conversations with people. We've had some very uncomfortable conversations of saying, we saw you trying to do X, Y, and Z. Did you know that this is possibly, something that could result in that? And again, approaching it not from the, IT police, but in the let's work together to make this a safer environment and let's have an open conversation. So it's learning from both of us. I want to better understand what you're trying to do with the data so I can help you do it in a more secure way. And there's just been a lot of great conversations and also process development that comes from the business out of it also because they didn't understand these risks, but it forces us to think together and having this greater, marketplace of ideas and working on how we can be more efficient too.
Right. I think one of the biggest challenges as a security leader, and I don't know why this is such a thing, but to find decent metrics in order to communicate that's actually meaningful, not just to you, but to,
Hmm.
your executive partners and that sort of thing. So is there, some example metrics or maybe some signals that you can, you know, explain to your organization that, hey, we're getting better at protecting data with AI usage?
I do agree that metrics have been a struggle for, a lot of organizations for a very long time. And again, as these platforms are changing, I think our metrics are going to have to change with it, along with technology. This is one of those areas where I say, those tools that I have set up, how many blocked alerts are we getting in? How many are we seeing a decrease in those? And to me, yes, more people are starting to use those. So what's the percentage wise of these blocked, AI alerts? And is it decreasing in that percentage? Because to me, if that percentage is decreasing, that means we're having the right conversations and we're starting to train users the right way. I don't think we can just do security awareness training where people are clicking through and they're really understanding the value and the risk of the data. That's where I think we're going to have more of these meaningful conversations. And so I want to see, again, it's not based on whole numbers, but the percentages. Because while these percentages numbers might be going down, the number of users using AI is going up every single day.
Mhm. Yeah, and the decisions that we're making around data protection today might not be the same, a year from now or 5 years,
Mhm.
probably more than likely not 5 years at all, as well as, the regulations, may be changing or regulations might be coming in. So working with vendors in order to do that, you might be reluctant to do a 5-year contract if it's something you're bringing in just for that. So how do you balance that?
We've actually had a lot of conversations around this. There is a lot less hardware that we're starting to use in our businesses, right? So we asked the question of what makes sense in having these long-term contracts anymore. Obviously, prices are a big driver in a lot of this. When you get into the 3 and 5 year, it kind of helps control costs to some extent. But when technology is changing as quickly as it is, it makes it really difficult to justify these long term, especially as we're jumping into more SaaS platforms. And I think AI is going to help drive that even faster. I really work with a lot of our business internally to say, what is the risk from a technology perspective in going long term when things are probably going to change even 6 to 8 months from now? Um, and again, what is the data needs that are going to change with that also? What we're doing with a platform today, or we intend to use it, in 6 months, is going to be much, much different 18 months from now. And I think that's really wild, just thinking about from when I started, in this industry a few years ago, we'll say, to how quickly, the platforms we need. And it also goes into cybersecurity. How are we securing technology if they're changing this rapidly? Um, I mean, man, how long does it take to be comfortable in a control that we put into place, right? Once we get into our environment, it's kind of like by the time we've got in place, we've got to evaluate and possibly turn it around just as quickly sometimes, it seems like.
Yeah, and I think another challenge is since we're talking about vendors, is the contract that you might have done a year ago, 6 months ago, even maybe 2 years ago. How does that vendor adopting AI change that contract as it is now? And then where does that go, moving forward? Because the data protections around it, what model are they using? How are they using it? And those sort of things. Have you come across any of those challenges?
I've not yet, but I will say this is where third party risk management becomes so important too. Again, going back to our foundations and our basics, with our internal programs, but making sure we're writing that into those programs, the third party risk management, having somebody that is staying up to date with those contracts and the vendors. Anytime a contract changes, understanding what that change means for us and our data. Um, I think we're going to have to put more focus and investment in people keeping track of what our vendors are doing and what those contracts mean when they change. Because I think, 5 years ago, it was very easy to assume those contracts were going to change a little bit year to year at best. But now there could be massive changes, especially with what they're doing with data that belongs to us.
Yeah, and I think that relationship with the business is huge there too. So that way, when the business hears, because it's usually the business that manages the overall agreement
Hmm.
with the vendor. And so whenever they're hearing that a change or they're getting ready to implement AI, to be notifying the security team, hey, you might want to take a look at this because, they're getting ready to do this. And then bring in, the vendor management group as well, and to do that proper risk assessment that's on there. So I think that's important to have, another great reason to have that great relationship with the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that this is also highlights that need for when we're talking about the vendor relationships, understanding that it's even more important now than ever to have a larger audience involved in this. As we're talking about the contracts changing so quickly, having that close relationship with your legal team in reviewing those contracts. and understanding what those implications are for you as a business, data owner. But what are the repercussions as far as you don't agree to a change that they make in their contract, a year or two down the road when you signed on for 3 to 5 years, you suddenly don't agree with the changes they've made on their terms of service. And so what are our options now, especially as we're trying our best to lower the risk for the business, but the technology is just moving at such a rapid pace that we're going to have to move much faster when it comes to those terms of service also.
Yeah, definitely. So, Kristi, you brought up like a wealth of amazing points here around AI and data protection. So, if listeners remember just one thing about securing AI through data protection, what should it be when they think of this episode here?
There's two things I'd love to take away. One is reviewing our foundations, right? Making sure we know how we're protecting our data, going back to third-party risk management, just all of the basics, and how we approach those. And then two, the relationships within the business. It makes these conversations much easier. They also tend to bring to us, the problems that they have much faster, or what's, solutions they're trying to make up for much earlier in the process. And so relationships, foundations, I think those are two things we really need to focus on going into the future to help make us successful in this, huge transformation phase of AI.
Yeah, because it's definitely changing how everyone's doing business, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
So, every episode I ask the guests the same, or basically the same questions, and I'm going to not change that. I'm going to do the same here with you, Kristi. So what is something that the security industry should do better or could do better?
I really think it's the relationships within the business, right? I don't think we're just about technology. I don't think we're just about how we can say no or secure from a technological perspective. I think we need to go shake hands. I think we need to get out face to face a lot more. And again, make it ourselves approachable to have easier conversations so we can be a part of the business decisions earlier on.
Yeah, I agree. And what is something that you are tired of hearing about?
Just in general with cybersecurity, because I think that's a very broad question. I just that cybersecurity has to be difficult to work with. I really want to change that image as much as we can to be enablers rather than I joke around that we're the no police. I don't want to be that. Yes, we might be the ones that put up the block page when you're trying to go shopping at Christmas. I get that it's frustrating. But I want it to be a comfortable conversation to go to one of us and say, I'd like to understand why. And whenever the users understand why, and they're not afraid to ask us, I think that helps the risk for the business overall too.
Yeah, I agree. So what is something, or what is a latest trend in security or privacy that you're actively monitoring right now?
Um, you know, right now I'm really trying to follow the regulation changes as far as it goes around with AI. I think privacy has been a big hot topic for a couple of years now. But now, what does that mean with AI taking in a lot of our users' data? I think there's going to be a lot of changes in the next year or two. And so I think all of us, from an international perspective, staying up to date and trying to understand what is it that we're going to have to understand from a compliance perspective, but also in protecting our own users also.
Right. Well, Kristi, thank you very much for being here today. I appreciate it. I always enjoy your insights. And for everyone else, thanks for hanging out with us on this episode of the Cyber Executive. If you like what you heard, hit that follow button on your favorite podcast app, and don't be shy. Share it with your friends. The more, the merrier. Kristi, again, thank you.
Thank you, Mark.